We are in like month 5 of Climate Week now. That's what it feels like. We are all completely sort of institutionalized to running backwards and forwards across Manhattan and having big conversations about climate change. So this session is one which I've been really looking forward to, which is talking with some amazing media representatives, some journalists, some storytellers about covering the solutions. Now, I've worked in the solutions business as co-founder and chief solutionist of Futerra for almost 21 years. And I have been to meeting after meeting and conference after conference of sustainability people bemoaning the fact that they can't get their stories into the media, as if the purpose of the media is to essentially be the PR industry of climate change solutions, which of course we would all love it if you were, but that of course isn't the purpose of media. So what we're here today to talk about is not why the media should cover solutions, but how the solutions industry, how those of us who are coming up with these answers can make our stories more media worthy. So what is it that makes a great story? And what makes a terrible one? So I'm so excited to welcome, and I'm going to make sure that I get everybody's job titles right, to welcome Justin Worland, Senior Correspondent at Time, Eric Roston, Sustainability Editor at Bloomberg, and Zoya Teirstein, Staff Reporter at Grist, all of whom I read regularly. So I am a little starstruck to have such amazing journalists on this panel with us. And thank you, because I know that usually you're the ones asking the questions, so it is quite fun to be able to ask you some questions. So let's get started right away into the bad. And now the motto of Solutions House is answers only. But let's just put that aside for brief. Tell me, if you will, an example of the worst pitch, the worst press release that you've had of someone trying to sell you a solution story. We want to really hear it, hit us with it about what we're getting really badly wrong. And feel free to name names or keep it anonymous if you want. And then maybe somebody in the audience might cringe in terms of it was theirs. So Justin, I'm going to come to you first.
Sure. Well, thanks for having this panel, and hopefully we can provide something insightful. I think the thing that comes to mind that drives me crazy are press releases from people who, don't know what they're talking about. And I think the thing that comes to mind to me is oftentimes it's not the people who are actually doing the work. It's some sort of third party that's been contracted, and you'll get an email that's very clearly not really steeped in this. And so the one that comes to mind is somebody who, first line in their email was explaining to me what the Paris Agreement is, and then explaining it incorrectly. And
I've been waiting for years for somebody to tell me what the Paris Agreement is.
Well, I mean, I think there are lots of things about what it can do and might do and is doing, but there are actually facts. Yeah. And so if you get the actual facts wrong, that's an immediate trash. So that's my example.
Brilliant. I love that. So someone telling a correspondent who's an expert in this what the Paris Agreement is. I want to know what they got wrong, the date, the stats. Did they call it the Berlin Agreement?
No, to be honest, I don't really remember. It was such a quick. I remember being struck by it, but I don't remember. It was probably a year ago or more.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much, Eric. Can you have a story that tops that in terms of terrible press release examples?
There's press releases that you screenshot the title of, and if it's bad enough, and you tweet it out. But I do feel bad doing that. So, but if it's really bad, you screenshot it and you send it to your colleagues. I think, sort of more seriously, it's hard to think of a single one, but there's a structural issue at hand, which is the difference between, really at the core, what journalism is and what PR is. And I get paid to go through as many sources as possible in the time allotted and put together a story with new facts that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And PR press releases are, by definition, are tied to a specific client usually, And so there's just like, before you even open an inbox, there's this disconnect between like a story, like particularly a long story could have like 20 or 30 sources. Like a small story, could have like half a dozen sources. And so like before you even open an email, like pitching one thing, it's just not what we do. And so, and like I think I'm probably an outlier in some ways. In my a lot of my work is very macro, but then maybe the last thing is just like somehow like the fashion and like jewelry people got all of our email addresses, and so like I get all this email about like sustainable jewelry, and I'm just like, I write about geology, I guess gold comes from somewhere,
Yeah. Zoya, what's your favorite worst one that you've clipped and sent around?
I did send this one around because I kept getting emails from this like animal rights group that had saved like 500 chickens from a slaughterhouse and sent me just unending number of emails about it. It was like nonstop. And the first few I was like, that's so sweet that they saved all those chickens. I'm so happy that that happened. I'm not gonna write about it. I'm a climate journalist, but that's great. And then by email 12, I was like, this has to end. Like, when's the end of the chickens? They're saved, that's it. There's nothing else to say.
A press release per chicken.
Right. That's like basically what it felt like. Yeah, I think that, and like any press release, and this is sort of casting a wide net, where it's like this one solution, this one thing will save the planet. I think that, anyone who really understands the extent of the climate crisis understands that there's one climate solution, which is stop burning fossil fuels. We've known that since the 1970s. So anything that pretends otherwise doesn't really begin to cover the extent of the issue. So when I get these claims, I'm like, it's an immediate X out, because I'm like, there's, it's like the solutions I like to cover are usually smaller scale, community level, not talking to some CEO of a tech company about what their tech that's very new and not scalable yet is going to do to save the planet. That doesn't usually work for me.
So you were talking there about the kind of solutions you do like to cover. Mm-hmm. So what for you, and you can give an example or just give me an outline of what makes a really great story. We heard about the number of sources that it needs, like there needs to be an angle, like what is just like the dream solution story on climate change for a journalist?
That's to me.
Yeah, but it will also be to these two. But I'm going to go backwards and forwards.
I think it's beat dependent. So like everyone, for example, my colleague Emily Pontecorvo writes about carbon capture and storage a lot. She writes about hydrogen. I mean, those are solution stories to some extent. She writes about it with a very keen eye. Not everything is a solution, but she writes about it when it is a solution. She writes about it well. But to me, that's not. That doesn't really get me going. I'm not super excited by hydrogen or. I'm more excited by public health stories, by communities sort of banding together to help each other out of a tough situation. I was in Alaska reporting a story about that a few years ago, where one community in Kodiak, which is a very small city in Alaska, they had this threat where there was this toxic shellfish issue just washing up on their shores, and people were getting really sick, some of them were dying, and the community sort of banded together to help each other out. It was the tribes and local researchers and the local university that were all working together to do this, and I thought that was a really cool story, so I flew out to cover it, and that's the kind of thing that gets me really excited about solutions.
Brilliant, thank you. Eric, for you, what's the formula for a great story on solutions?
If there were a formula, I wouldn't have to work so hard. The very first story I did on this topic was about, I don't know, people may know the name Sally Bingham, who's a reverend in San Francisco and had her own congregation. And many years ago, she decided she wanted to buy solar panels and get solar panels on the roof of the synagogue because it was conducive to scripture. And I was just like utilities and scripture just had not entered my mind before. And from that story, I was pretty hooked on the notion that these energy and climate stories that are really cool are about totally counterintuitive partnerships. Yeah. And I think that's true today as well. And now, a lot of the email we get are about, counterintuitive partnerships. So maybe the bar is higher now. But I think you look at what happens at universities where all these the departments collide, and it's just when people are in the same room and have no reason to be in the same room, that's usually a good story.
Thank you. Would you agree, Brendan, or is there a different good story on climate solutions for time?
Well, I think I do agree with that. I mean, and I think the strange bedfellow stories around solutions can be really, really interesting. But what I would say, I think, for me, I don't necessarily think about telling a solution story per se. I think about, as Eric said, a lot of my stories are more macro, looking at taking a 50,000-foot view. And I will write a story about a problem and get into the depth of the problem, and then maybe 2/3 of the way through say, well, here's what the solution might be, or here's what the different discussions are around how we might solve this. And so I think for me, and I think for a lot of journalists, solution stories are integrated into storytelling more broadly. Which I do think raises a bigger point, with the press releases, and this kind of came up already, to expect a story that is about your solution is not as likely as, pointing, how does that fit into the bigger picture?
Yeah. So this is, I'm already beginning to see some themes, which of course are going to be perfectly obvious to you because you're journalists, but probably not so much to the community that we're talking to, which is, but both Zoya and Eric, you spoke about, in some ways, people, unexpected collaborations, communities coming together. And those, of course, are about the solutionists, about the people who are doing things, rather than necessarily about the thing, which I think is something which is often forgotten. And then also that actually, how do you put it together into an overall story and put it in? So how important is there to be a person who can represent the story? So often in sustainability, we take the person out. We talk about the technology, we talk about the stats, maybe we talk about a polar bear, but actually putting human beings in and there being characters and interesting people, it's almost as if we sort of try to take that out sometimes of sustainability. So is this crucial? Do we need there to be characters and interesting people to talk to? Or does the actual just facts or stats, or there's a new report, or there's a new something, does that count?
Well, to me, yes. Well, I would say people certainly can anchor a story. I think there is, at least for me, and I think probably for most journalists, there's a high bar, right? So, the average founder of a startup working in climate tech is probably not going to meet that bar, unless they've done something truly exceptional, or they're incredibly charismatic, or there's just got to be something that really elevates it to be a story about a person. But that is an approach. But characters are necessary to any story, right? So even if they're not, if it's not about the person, you need somebody. Well, you don't necessarily. I mean, there's lots of different. You could do data journalism, whatever. But it's, for me, it's often important to have a character. So it certainly doesn't hurt you. But I wouldn't hang too much on that.
I thought of another email answer.
Okay. Oh, yeah, we want them all the way through.
Well, probably one of the worst things you could do is say, hey, here's this exciting thing, and it's so exciting that Zoya and Justin wrote about it. And I'm just well, I don't have to do it.
Right.
We don't do stories that other people have written.
Yeah.
Or at least that's what we tell ourselves as we write the same story that everybody else has written. People.
People.
So that's interesting. And so I think I write about people very rarely. And as a reader is how I kind of want to answer the question, right. Which is in the 90s, journalists just got addicted to the anecdotal lead. Every story in any scale had to start out with, as so-and-so had coffee in their kitchen or whatever. And I find, and I've talked about this with other people, so it's not just me, and maybe it'll resonate more widely, is given the amount of things we can read at any given moment, I see an anecdotal lead, and I'm just why am I here? I scroll down to the 5th paragraph so I can just get the information to why I'm here. But then I sit down and lose 3 hours of the New Yorker, So, as a writer, I rely almost never, I think, on anecdotal leads, but I could be an outlier.
I'm trying to think. I think that I think that characters are important in the sense that they help create some source of tension in the piece that keeps people reading. But that doesn't mean that those characters have to be human beings. Like the main characters of a piece that I'm writing right now are two dogs named Frost and Sully. So I don't think it necessarily has to be people, but I do think that tension is important. I don't know if it's as crucial for shorter pieces. I agree that if I have to scroll past an anecdotal lead for a 600-word story, I probably won't even really scroll. I'll probably just go somewhere else for it. But if it's a longer story, if it's a feature, yeah, I mean, I try and think about what readers might want and what I would want as a reader, which I am, an avid reader of all types of journalism. I love a good character. I love the tension that keeps me hooked.
So this is great. What do readers want? Because I think, again, sometimes in the solutions industry, we have a want, which is our story placed, our solutions placed, and there to be more focus on the answers to climate change. But we're thinking about I think too often we're thinking about what journalists want rather than what readers want. So we're trying to get the perfect press release to get a journalist's interest. And going, if I tweeted this, would anybody actually retweet it? Is probably a good sign that maybe the readers aren't interested in it. So what are readers interested in? Like, actually, what do people want to read? Because I think outside of journalism, most of us don't know. Eric?
I think the question I probably ask PR people more than anything else is, what do you and your colleagues talk about when you're not talking about work that's work related? Because that's what we write about. We write about what people are talking about. And if we're not talking about your press release, we're not going to write it. But if you had lunch with a colleague and you got completely wrapped up over whatever it is, like a corrupt local official or a platform that doesn't work, or, if you're talking about it, other people are going to want to talk about it. That's how that works.
I would say that it is. I'm not glued to our traffic or anything, but I have a sense of what our traffic looks like, and I would say I have no idea what the reader wants. That sometimes, here's a solution story I wrote about border carbon adjustment in 2019. Wonky solution. I was interested in it. I thought it would be a fun thing to write. It was, I believe, our second most read climate story that year. It exploded. We had a good headline, whatever, but it's very hard to predict what's going to grab people, particularly on the internet. It's just things have a life of their own. So I guess what I boil it down to is good stories, things that are interesting, things that you find interesting. As you said, something you would talk about outside of work. Good story.
Actually, if I...
No, yeah, go ahead.
I was at Time Magazine before Justin was, and I know, he's been there since 1923, right? No, but and in that Washington bureau with those people, very high-powered, very smart, intimidating people, I did not belong there. I'm sure they would agree. There was sort of a heuristic that if we found ourselves in a story, in a Tuesday meeting, talking about a story, and we found ourselves talking about it for 10 minutes without noticing we were talking about it, then it was probably a cover story.
Yeah.
We still have that rule, slightly different. 5 minutes, then it's a story.
What's a cover?
Yeah.
So, what makes a great story?
Man, I think one of the joys of working for a nonprofit newsroom such as Grist.org is that I don't have to really think all that much about what's being read and what's not being read. Although I do pay attention to it. It's always nice when something gets read. But I think that I'd like to reframe the question a little bit. I wonder whether it might help PR folks to know that if you can show me that not just that you care about something, but that a community cares about it, that it might have some sort of impact, that would make me look twice. I think that those kinds of emails would probably attract a little more attention from journalists.
We're talking a lot about PRs and PR professionals. Let's put them aside, that is literally their job, but a huge number of the solutions that are coming are not coming from people who have got a PR agency now. They're coming from local communities, they're coming from parts of the world where perhaps they hadn't even thought that maybe they might be able to be covered in one of your places. How do you find out about stories that don't have a PR team? Because I think quite a lot of the people, particularly those who are watching online, are perhaps working on incredible things with great stories, great communities, great impacts, controversy, challenge, and it wouldn't occur to them to write a press release about it. So do you find them, do you Google? Like, do you listen to, do people give you tips? Like, how do people who don't have a PR team sort of get their story told? Or how do you find those stories? Sorry.
Oh, I'm a huge fan of the cold call. I love calling an organization and saying, hey, what are you working on? That's how I got the idea for my most recent story, which is about those 2 dogs, by calling this organization and just saying, hey, what are you working on? And this guy, Pete, walked me through 5 or 6 of their projects. And at the last second, I was like, all right, thanks so much for your time. It was sort of a wash. And then he was like, wait, we've got one more thing. You might be interested in an environmental justice story. And I was like, yeah, that's the one. So I'm a big fan of calling. It's always fun finding a story on your own. It's kind of like a treasure hunt. But I don't have a formula for doing it. It's like I felt like I've stumbled upon these gems somewhat by accident in the past, which is always a fun surprise. But I'm not sure I have a formula.
I think sometimes when I see some of the communities that I work with, or some of the folks who are working on non-tech solutions, they almost sort of pull the guts and glory out of it, and they just want to give the facts, and their own passion and energy and obsession with these topics don't come through because they're trying to write like a PR. And so I think one of the things which we're hearing now is like, if these are people who constantly talk to each other about this topic, maybe that's what should come through, rather than the sort of slightly dry information that sometimes people provide. How do you find stories, Eric?
I don't know. I mean, there's just no, like, if you've written a story, then you're not going to write that story again in the same way. And so you're just looking for, it's like trying to find the seam in the wallpaper. It's like, okay, there's something there, kind of work with that. It's not very helpful, but it is just sort of intuitive in a way. And there's things like, there's the peer-reviewed journals, which is, science journalism is another whole topic, but I don't know, it's just got to be interesting.
Yeah. Justin?
Well, I would say there's maybe 2 buckets, or maybe 3, but there's buckets that are on the news, journals, something that's happened in the news, and I'm going to sort of report and talk to people about it, and maybe find my own angle and way into it. And then there's the stories, I think, that are more like, I heard something that I know there's something there, but I don't quite know what it is, and it leads to like a Google rabbit hole and calls and whatever. One thing I do a lot of is read local news. So if I think there's something happening in a community, I will subscribe to the local newspaper. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, I did a story in San Diego about a road usage fee, which is a part of their bigger, more than $100 billion transportation plan for the San Diego region. There were like, a few 300-word stories in the local news. I read all of them, and I was like, this is a crazy story that nobody has really done justice. And then, went out there and found a whole bunch of other stories, a story about air pollution on the border, which had really only been, there's like an advocacy group that has a terrible I shouldn't say that, but they didn't know how to promote their own stuff, but was pointing to these issues. And so it's really like, for me, oftentimes pulling threads, seeing an idea and then seeing where it leads. The one thing I'll just say is just more like something you can use is, I certainly welcome emails from people. I mean, I welcome emails from PR people, but from people who aren't PR people, I think that definitely gets me to pay attention a little more. And frankly, it's not like all or most of those even turn into stories, but it definitely, if you're taking the time to say, I read what you do, I think that this is something that you would be interested because of real reasons, I would pay attention to that.
William?
Actually, I thought of a better answer, which is like, and and on the topic of like formulas, I mean, I sort of make light of it, but like obviously, like when news happens, we have formulas, right? And it didn't occur to me 5 minutes ago, but like, you know, a big report comes out or, you know, a big event happens, like here are the 5 things you need to know. We're gonna write a story about the 5 things you need to know. There's probably a dozen formula stories that we do, you know, within the week of a major news event happening that we're just gonna do because like we have to do something and, you know, we did it last time. So like, just read us and like, that's the most obvious one is like the top 5 things, like we're gonna do that. So like, what's one of them?
So I think there's, again, for those who are watching, getting into the local news, I think sometimes people like don't think that's important and that they want to go for one of you guys and get something really big, whereas actually you're watching the local news, you're looking for these stories that are coming out. So I think that's a really, really great angle. And then actually being able to set out, these are the important things, these are the top 5 things that comes out, I think is also really fantastic. Let's talk about sort of, and Justin, you spoke about the solution being in the story. You know, we've all heard the line, if it bleeds, it leads. The fact that the problems, the crises, that's news. Like when something horrendous happens, like it's happening in Puerto Rico, that's happening in Pakistan. These are news stories. And particularly with climate change, over the next couple of months and years, unfortunately, we've got those locked in. There are going to be a whole series, unfortunately, horrifically, of if it bleeds, it leads, extreme weather event stories. What we don't have locked in is sort of the solutions to that, the answers to that. And so, and I said I wasn't going to ask you how do we get more solution stories in and can you cover them all? But how do we make sure that those of us who are trying to work on the answers can kind of cut through that unrelenting but incredibly important news of the horrors and the impacts? You know, it can be very difficult when you're reading story after story after story of these negative impacts and there aren't solutions in it. Is it because the solutions we're giving you just don't feel like they stack up against the problem? Or is it just like a rule of news? Yes, okay.
Totally.
The solutions don't feel like they stack up against the
Well,
problem.
like I mentioned in the beginning, I mean, there is one overarching climate solution. It's stop burning fossil fuels. We knew this back in 1970. Congress knew it then. It's not, that's why I get frustrated with these solutions that I get sometimes where I'm like, doesn't really solve any of the real problem. There's a lot of adaptation stories that are totally solution-based. Yeah. And I think the point you bring up is really a good one, that people get when there's disaster fatigue, and injecting solutions in there is really important. But I also kind of I also steer clear of putting a solution in a story for the solution's sake. It doesn't feel totally genuine and authentic to the situation to do that all of the time. So I don't know. It's a really good question. I wish I had a better answer.
If I had the answer, I would be telling you.
Well, I think there's this point of nuance and figuring out how to communicate to a journalist that this isn't the silver bullet. You know, in response to a hurricane, you know, this wasn't going to stop the hurricane, but perhaps there is something that is worth noting that adds to the nuance and complexity of your story. I think that's the kind of thing that if, you know, I were working on solutions, I would be looking to do, right? Not trying to say, hey, look at this happy, positive thing, but actually saying, oh, your story about this really sad thing is really sad, and also, you know, here's this piece that's interesting and important and nuances your story.
I find that in appropriate cases, like it's intolerable not to have a positive note or like some forward-looking thing. I mean, just one example, I do like a wrap-up of all the latest peer-reviewed science in the magazine, Green Magazine, which comes out several times a year. And it's just like, it's just so overwhelming. And it's such a bummer. Like, maybe it's just me psychologically, but like the editors let me get away with it. Like the last third of it is always solutions, because it's like, it's just intolerable to leave it at observations of what's happening.
we're actually, later this week, we're doing a session on storytelling in Hollywood and about how it would be nice to have a climate story where we don't all fucking die at the end. We could only have so many of those. So you just mentioned editors. I love the fact that, thank you so much for that. That sail away, that cannot be better. June, thank you. So you just mentioned editors. Have you ever had a story that you really wanted to write and you thought that was great, that you just couldn't get placed, you couldn't get agreed? Obviously, you're all fantastic at your job, and every single thing you write immediately gets run, and your editors are just waiting outside the door, sort of wringing their hands, waiting for the most recent piece that you're going to hand to them. But is there anything which you've wanted to write about, particularly on solutions, but not exclusively, which just, you couldn't actually get filed? Or are you allowed to say, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask that, actually.
I think it's fine, but I'm gonna dodge it a little bit. I wanted to write a story about an invasive insect that was killing a bunch of trees in upstate New York, and I wanted to do a classic story where I did the problem and what people are kind of like trying to do to stem the problem, but mostly the problem, and at the end do the solution. And my editor at the time, who's now the new CEO of Grist, who's in the audience right now, gave me this challenge. He was like, can you try doing the solution up top? Can you start off with it? And that to me was like kind of a whole different story, but it was a really cool challenge because it broke up that formula and made the solution feel a little more authentic. Like the solution led, which is not a saying in journalism, but maybe it could be, I don't know. But yeah,
if it solves, it leads.
Right. It doesn't quite rhyme, but yeah. So I think that I don't know that I have an example of a story that was canned or anything, but I do have examples of editors saying, hey, like at Grist, we try. The goal of the organization is to infuse all our coverage with solutions. It's not just solution stories. Grist writes about solutions and everything that we do. So I think that kind of changing the way we think about solutions is an interesting challenge and a great thing for journalists.
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
I think that we're past the point in history where stories are getting killed because people like us are too early.
Right.
There were a lot of years where different places it was hard to write these stories because we're dealing with primary sources, and so we saw first what's happening. I guess one part of this maybe is there's a tweet, of course, that came around, and I wish I knew what it was because I think about it all the time. And it was a view of a writer at the beginning of the career versus a view of a veteran writer. And the writer at the beginning of the career, it was a gif of like, my words, you're hurting my words, you're killing my babies. And then the veteran writer, it was just, you fix it. So there is that element of, it starts to be an assembly line, and there's things you care about and things you don't care about, and you win some and you lose some, and most of the time the editors are right. You listening? Yeah.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, yes, obviously there are lots of stories that I pitched that did not get taken. I do think, with the benefit of hindsight, I can think about a lot of those and say, probably not the worst call. But I guess I don't really have a great answer. It's the long and short of it.
No, it's so interesting for us because, of course, you're the climate bait. You know how this works. You've been doing it for a long time. For the rest of us, it's almost like sort of this mysterious process of what happens, what gets chosen by the journalist. Sort of, and of course, for many of us, it sort of almost feels like it's like I pick you. So it's so interesting to hear about why.
So I got a call yesterday from a guy I know who works on clean energy grid stuff, and he said, "Oh, the article was so great. It was, whatever. It was a dinky article, but like, how long did you work on it?" And it was, I I got an email Friday morning from my editor saying, you have the Monday newsletter, where is it? And I was like, I wrote up the last conversation I had, and we just went with it, and I finished something else at the end of the day. So it's like, the amount of chaos is unbelievable.
And the sort of luck of timing, right? I mean, if you tried to pitch something or to have a conversation about a story when the Inflation Reduction Act dropped, good luck. Like that month was gone. Luck.
I've just come from the UK where obviously last week there was no news at all for a week. So yeah, the issue of context being quite key. So we're coming towards the end of our time, and I think this session and this conversation has probably given a lot of people a lot of hope about the fact that actually if they thought more about a story, if they thought more about what they were passionate about and where the actual interest and excitement is rather than the information, and perhaps those who don't and can't afford a PR agency means that you are still allowed to talk to a journalist even if you're not a PR and you're allowed to put it. Let's talk briefly about Twitter. And about Twitter as a news source, as a source of hell, as a source of so much of the public discourse now seems to be happening in public. Are you on Twitter? Do you find it really difficult in terms of how people are responding to your stories? Like how has that changed life for a journalist, particularly on the climate beat? Because we know the topics that we care about and talk about, there are a lot of, how should I say this politely, extremely vocal, all upper caps held views on our topic. So like how do you negotiate that? Because a lot of people will be reading you, but a lot of people will be following you as well on Twitter. So how's that changed? Like, has it changed journalism? So that's quite a big question. Has Twitter changed journalism?
Yeah, this panel is actually the longest I haven't been on Twitter in 10 years.
You don't sleep?
Something really massive will have happened right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll.
Yeah, is that
No,
on Twitter all the time?
it's Twitter is obviously destroying democracies and the fabric of society. But if with just a little bit of time, it's just the most remarkable tool for like micro professional communities that's ever been. It's just like everything, like all the researchers, there's so much that you learn about that you wouldn't otherwise learn about. It's useful for getting in touch with people. Twitter is like what the service that the front page of newspapers used to provide is now Twitter in some ways. I don't want to I don't rely on it all that for everything, but instead of having a dozen guys sitting in a room deciding what's going to be on the front page, your front page is assembled by however many thousand people who you've asked to do it for you. So it's
1,000 white guys in a room.
Yeah. Right.
So one of the things which really interests me about people who work in this field, and for journalists, this must be in some ways even more intense, is we work every day dealing with, I think somebody called it the sort of apocalypse beat, the really, really, really difficult stuff. And as journalists, you're not just got one area of focus, which most of us have. You have to look at the entirety of the climate piece. And yet you're still in there. You're still telling those stories. You're still making it happen. How do you cope? How do you keep your energy up, your desire to keep writing about this? Because we're human beings as well, and we get scared and overwhelmed and worried. At the end of the day, do you just put this down? How do you keep your essential hope and desire to keep writing about this, even though so much of what you have to write about is so difficult?
I think. I think it feels like a purposeful career to do that, right? It feels like there's something that is hopefully adding something positive to society in doing my job. So I think that's what keeps me going to do it. I think I find that I often I've learned that I need to take a time at night where I don't look at Twitter and I read a book and I, sort of try a book that is not about climate and not about politics and is about something completely different. So just finding times to check out from it is what I'd say.
Thank you, Eric.
The sometimes gallows humor, sometimes weeping, a lot of meditation. That's helps a lot of people, I think. And there's a bunch of different answers. I mean, one of them, and like the nerdiest answer I could think of, is that like I've been doing this for a long time, and I noticed after a couple of years that and I wrote a book about this ultimately, that once you ask the stupidest possible question, which is, what is carbon?
Yeah.
Then it's not just carbon dioxide, it's like you start, it's 80% of the structure of DNA, and just from carbon dioxide, asking the stupidest possible question about what that is, you get transported on the entire conveyor of life. Yeah. The ancient atmospheres, the layers that we can tell in the rock, why the fossil fuel is there, where it's going to go next, how we got to have fingers. There's no limit to how many disciplines of knowledge you can organize by just looking through carbon dioxide. Yeah. And there's a lot of reasons I pay attention to this, but certainly the nerdiest one is it just helps everything make sense.
Yeah. Brilliant. Wow, that was a philosophical level. You and I are going to talk entropy at some point. Second law of thermodynamics and carbon.
I just need a second to stop reeling from that.
Yeah.
Let's see. I don't know. I think that the human capacity for protecting itself from bad news is pretty astounding. I put this stuff down at the end of the day and I don't think about it again, to be honest. But then I'll cry when I see roadkill randomly. Yeah. So it comes out in other ways. But I was in Montana on the Blackfeet Reservation on Sunday, and I was talking to this woman who is working to protect her tribe from a number of threats. I won't get into them now. You'll have to read the article. But her capacity for hope was enormous, and it kind of knocked me off my feet. And I think that for me, reporting, being in the field, seeing people, communities, those characters, dogs occasionally up close, is the way that I keep going, because it's so exciting and people are incredibly hopeful despite the odds, and that makes me more hopeful.
So that's a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much. I want to take this opportunity on behalf of everybody who pitches you, and most of you don't cover them, and sends you the awful press releases, but all of us are immensely grateful that there is a carbon beat. We are so pleased that we have journalists such as you being able to keep this, find the stories, keep it going, keep it talked about. I started my journey in this in the late 90s, and I have seen the impact that your journalism has had in terms of the public profile and the conversation about climate change. So I just wanted to close. I was just going to say thank you. Oh. And in my thanks, obviously, if there is, my thanks include gratitude and platforming. So
Well, I just wanted to share one of my favorite episodes with a press a communications person ever, what happened last year, and we're, I don't know how close everyone is to climate nerddom, but there are what are called scopes: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and it's a way of accounting for emissions. And our whole lives from dawn to dusk is with scopes for that period of months. And I was on a call with colleagues and I said, let's just write about scope X. And scope X is all of the emissions that you can't count because it's from the big PR companies and the law firms and the accounting agencies. And everybody's like, oh my God, you have to write scope X. You do it for a column. And then months went by and I wrote it. And then I did the worst thing you could possibly do, which is Google your cool idea. And she had already written it. And so I had to go back and I rewrote it from scratch because it was no longer about our cool idea. It was about her cool idea. And what the lesson there that I think is real is earnestness and thought leadership are real things that are accessible to everyone. And you can go out on the internet and be better than us, which is not a very high bar. But like that was like, that's the best. You didn't ask like, what's the best one? What's the best example? But that's the answer to the best example.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate that, and I promise I will keep writing things solely to annoy you. So, Justin, Eric, sorry, Sam, thank you so much. I think you will probably find that these were simple, obvious things to you about how this world works, and were incredibly valuable and useful to those people who are working so hard to actually make these solutions and really want to tell the story about it. And I think you've just made the world a little bit more interesting in the world of solutions. Thank you so very much. Please join me in thanking Justin and Eric.